there.
How are you both tonight?
Good. How are you?
Welcome back to Magic in the Noise. Today we are talking to Laird Scranton, who is a researcher in all things Scarabray, Egypt, Dogon tribe related, and we are going to be connecting his research with David's recent session on Scarabray and the Scarabray stone spheres. So hello David, hello Laird.
Hello.
David, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, so we had done a remote viewing session, which I was blind to, which was associated with these carved stone balls at Scarabray. At the time, I had no idea about that subject or topic. I did my session work. What I found interesting during analysis was all of these synchronicities. I immediately went to one of your video sessions and skipped to a section that was closer to where you were actually discussing the toy balls. And immediately the thing that you were talking about was the megalithic sites there at Scarabray, how they had the Dogons encoding energy basically forming into matter. And that was part of what I got at my session work, was that kind of concept, which kind of like really blew me away. So over the course of like, I don't know how long it's been, weeks at least, we've seen amazing synchronicities. Like I went to your book, The Mystery of Scarabray, Neolithic Scotland and Origins of Ancient Egypt. The first page I went to in the book, because I was doing like a search, I saw a drawn element that had showed up during analysis in my work. And the topic that was kind of being talked about was, again, plugged into some of the concepts that I got.
Will you tell us a little bit about some of the early connections that you made between the Dogon tribe and Scarabray?
Okay, the work that I do is comparative study of symbolic elements of an ancient system of cosmology. Cosmology is how a culture understands how certain creational processes came about. The Dogon, when they say cosmology, they're talking about how matter forms, how the universe formed, how biological life comes about, and how consciousness comes about. The Dogon are a modern-day primitive African tribe from Mali, a remote region of Mali, and their cultural imperative is to preserve original forms. They're trying to retain the original meanings of words, the original meanings of symbols, and the original forms of symbols, and the original ideas that connected with that. The Dogon priests say that their symbolic tradition explains how matter forms. But in truth, what it does is those creational processes I just mentioned are considered to be parallel processes. They all rest on a single cluster of dynamics of energy. And so to emphasize that fact, the symbolic system presents a single progression of symbols that simultaneously describe all four of those processes at the same time. So consequently, we can't really ask what a symbol represents. We can only ask, what does it represent if we're talking about the formation of matter, or what does it represent if we're talking about biological reproduction? The Dogon perspective is that in ancient times, a group of knowledgeable teachers presented a symbolic system as an educational process that was presented globally to many different cultures around the planet. Probably the best proof or demonstration that could be true is found with the archetypes of Carl Jung, who struggled with understanding how it could be that so many widespread cultures had the same symbolic references, the same mythological themes, the same mythological storylines, the same symbolic elements connected to the same symbolism. And his conclusion was that it connected down to sort of a collective unconsciousness, that people are thinking the same thoughts at the same time. That could be possibly true. The perspective of the ancient traditions I work with is that these were the product of deliberate instruction. So the situation is similar to if you and I had gone to high school in different years, but we had the same math teacher, and that teacher had used certain techniques to explain things, certain examples and diagrams and so forth. And we discovered at a cocktail party that we had all of these references in common with each other, even though we'd never met before.
Yes. Yeah, I find that to be utterly fascinating, because there's different pieces of what you just described, which I can see correlated, I think Sasha could too, with elements that came out of my work, along with other stuff Sasha and I have actually been discussing in the past few weeks. One part of my session work, because I think it ties in somewhat with what you're describing here, I got to a portion that was more associated with something like a druid circles. I actually wrote down like druid circle. So this would be like Scarabray, think the megalithic sites, right? And I'm going through and I'm trying to decode what it is. And during that process, initial stages was like, well, there's energy here, and they're using the environment in a way that's harvesting the energy. Like they understand how this works. Like it's leveraging basically knowledge along with natural properties to essentially create a more complex result or a more amplified result, essentially. When I continued to go through that process to try to understand, like, what is this to get more details, I picked up on the concept of like webbing, net, dome were some of the first words. And in my mind, I'm shifting around to different concepts and going like, well, it's kind of like that, but not like that. And as I move through that process, I get to a point where I start to realize that these structures are essentially connected together through a network. And there were two key elements that I got out of that. One is that each individual site has its own particular function that's different than the rest, but they're also linked together, and as a totality, they also have another level of function that works together. The individual level of function is more associated with stuff like physical effects, like altering, what I wrote down was like acceleration of chemistry or acceleration of metallurgy. Like there are certain properties where I think the physics can be altered or adjusted or bumped a little bit at that particular location. So there's sort of a physical component or effect. Basically, that was one concept that came out of that. In terms of them being linked together, their function was more about the 100th monkey effect. Like the idea that I got was the concept of ancient people who in one part of the world had farming,
Right.
somebody else had farming, like similar ideas. What I got was the idea was that these circles were used to actually affect consciousness, influence consciousness on like a global scale, to almost like put the seed of information or knowledge that would propagate through the collective. That was another piece that I got. We can go into more details, but essentially, do you think that kind of ties in somewhat with your research?
Yeah, now let me try to explain how it is that happens. A lot of the Dogon words were also ancient Egyptian words. The Dogon don't have a written language, but the ancient Egyptians did adopt a hieroglyphic language. So key words in this tradition carry clusters of meanings, and those clusters carry over. They cross over between cultures and between languages. So the clusters of meanings associate with the concept, not the phonetics. So I can go to an entirely different language than the Dogon language and discover the same clusters of meanings associated with the same concept. And because of that, I'm able to correlate words between languages that are very different sometimes.
That's
Okay,
interesting.
now
Yes.
what's going on with the energetics is, okay, I discovered as I was working with Egyptian hieroglyphic language, okay, the first thing is that in very early languages prior to 500 BC, in various ways, the languages self-confirm the meanings of their own words. As a matter of fact, that's true of every element that's original to the symbolic tradition, is that there's a level of self-confirmation of meaning that comes with the symbol. That's part of the
Wow.
way that we recognize it as being original. But the Dogon words do it because the language is based on a long set of what I call root syllables, phonetic values that are associated with root concepts. And when the Dogon want to express a more complicated idea, they mix and match those syllables to express the right combination of concepts to explain what that new concept is. So if I know how a Dogon word was pronounced, I can infer from the pronunciation of the word what it was originally intended to represent. Same thing with Egyptian hieroglyphics, that each glyph, each picture glyph, is associated with a concept. And when I'm presented with an ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic word, it works sort of like a child's rebus puzzle where you see a picture of an eye and you substitute the word eye. If we substitute concepts for glyphs, we produce a symbolic sentence that explains the intended meaning, nuances of meaning of the word that the scribe was trying to write. As a matter of fact, there's certain classes of words that are there to define, to assign meanings to particular glyphs. And so once I figured
Mm.
that out, then I could now lay out literally hundreds of Egyptian glyphs and what they represent based on the authority of the language, not on my guesswork.
Wow. That's
Now, as I was
fascinating.
working with those languages, I discovered one of my first confusions was that the ancient Egyptians have two glyphs that represent the concept of time. I thought, why in the world would you need two glyphs to represent the concept of time? It's because the system defines two modes of time. Um, I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this to you. The best way to illustrate it, okay, I'll tell you what the two modes are, and then I'll tell you a couple of ways of illustrating it. The modes of time One is an ultra-fast oscillation that is kind of an overview mode, and the other one is a much slower linear progression of time that defines events materially. And the net effect of those two modes of time, it works like a jazz combo, where every individual player has complete freedom to play what they want, but it's got to be in keeping with the theme of the larger piece that the jazz combo is playing. So
Interesting.
that's one thing that's tying back to the energetics you were talking about, where you have both an overview and a detail. Those are also the two modes of human consciousness: the ability to see a thing in overview, break it down into its components, and then reconstruct it mentally into the whole thing again. If you can do that, that defines consciousness. I compare it to when the average person looks at a scene with two eyes that have two slightly different views. The brain is able to translate that into a 3D image. And it's the simple fact of looking at it from two separate viewpoints that automatically does that.
I'm going to jump in here for a second because I don't want to lose this
I
thought,
know.
but
Yeah.
it ties into something that David and I have been talking about, shadows in the 3-dimension of 4th-dimensional forms. And we were also talking about time and the morpheme Tan in the Dogon tribe language, which is Tan is time, and I was looking into Tanit, the goddess. But what I want to just put on record here, because I'll come back to this later to expand on it for myself, but it's that idea of, so you have the stereoscopic view, but rather than of physical matter, of reality, of time itself. So if you're looking at time from a stereoscopical perspective, then you're adding a 4th dimensional view of time in a way. Do you know what I mean?